My name is Walter Green. I am 76 years old, and most mornings I wake up to the sound of the heating system clicking on in my small house in Iowa, a sound that has become my only consistent company. The house is not large, just a modest single-story place on a quiet street that I once shared with my wife Eleanor before she passed away 12 years ago. Since then, the rooms have grown heavier with silence, and even the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room feels less like a rhythm of life and more like a reminder of how empty the hours have become. I try to keep myself busy. I read the local paper cover to cover. I write in an old leather-bound journal Eleanor gave me for our 40th anniversary. I take slow walks around the neighborhood when the weather allows, but nothing fills the absence of real family warmth. Nothing gives back the sense that I am needed, not just tolerated. My son and daughter, Michael and Carol, are both middle-aged now, with careers and families of their own, and though they live not far, Michael about an hour's drive away, Carol a bit closer in Des Moines, they rarely stop by unless there is paperwork to be signed or some important family matter that requires my presence. I used to believe their distance was simply the way of modern life, that children grow busy with their jobs, mortgages, and children of their own, and that old parents must not demand too much of them. That is what I told myself when the phone didn't ring on my birthday. When Thanksgiving passed with only a quick call from Carol saying she had to work late, when Christmas invitations were sent too late for me to arrange travel. I swallowed the loneliness and told myself it was selfish to expect more. But deep inside, I always harbored a small hope that one day they would come knocking not for signatures or money or favors, but simply to share an evening meal, to talk about memories, to ask how I was doing, not out of obligation, but because they truly wanted to know. My health is not terrible for my age, though I move slower than I used to, and the stiffness in my knees reminds me daily that time is no longer my ally. I manage my own cooking, though it has become a ritual of repetition: oatmeal in the morning, soup and bread for lunch, something simple for dinner. Eleanor loved to cook, and her recipes still sit in a little wooden box on the kitchen counter, handwritten in her elegant cursive. Sometimes I take one out, run my fingers across the faded ink, and think about how her meals always smelled like comfort itself. I never try to replicate them. I know I would fail. The box stays as a shrine of sorts, a relic of love and devotion that my children hardly acknowledge when they visit. They glance at it as if it is just clutter, just another old person's sentimental object, not understanding that inside those cards is a life we once built together. After Eleanor's death, I tried hard to keep the family close. I invited Michael and Carol for Sunday dinners. I offered to babysit my grandchildren whenever they needed. I drove hours to attend birthdays and recitals. At first, they allowed it, but slowly the invitations grew fewer, the phone calls shorter, and the sense of welcome dimmed. Michael always had a meeting. Carol always had errands, and I was left waiting at a table set for guests who never came. I convinced myself that it was fine, that as long as they occasionally stopped by, I still had a family. That illusion became my lifeline. It is important to understand who I am before the storm of betrayal that came later. I am not reckless or naive. I spent 40 years as an insurance clerk, a profession built on caution, double-checking documents, ensuring no one signed anything without understanding it. I taught countless clients to never trust a form without reading it carefully. Yet in my personal life, when it came to my children, I ignored my own rule. I believed that blood guaranteed honesty, that a father's trust was sacred, and that the children I once carried in my arms would never deceive me. This faith became my greatest weakness, and they knew it. The truth is, I was a man softened by love, made pliable by the ache of wanting to still matter. I remember Carol coming to me years ago with loan papers for a small business she was starting. She told me she only needed my signature for the bank to feel secure, and of course I signed without hesitation. Later, Michael asked me to co-sign for his mortgage. promising it was a formality, and again I signed, not because I had read the details, but because I could not bear the thought of saying no to my son. Each time, they thanked me briefly, their voices flat, already distracted by their own lives, but I carried the weight of those signatures like a badge of love. I told myself that I had helped them stand taller, that they would remember me not as a burden, but as the father who always supported them. I told myself lies to cover the sting of being treated as little more than a name on a line. Evenings are the hardest. I sit by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, and I imagine the laughter of families inside their homes, the smells of dinner, the sounds of conversations that spill into the night. I wonder if my children ever think of me at those times, or if I have become an afterthought, a name they scroll past on their phones but never call. I still keep Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, her smile bright and knowing, as if she foresaw all this. Sometimes I speak to her, quietly, telling her about my day, telling her about the loneliness, telling her about Michael and Carol and how I wish they would come by, just to ask about the old days. I know it is foolish to expect answers, but the photograph listens better than my living family ever has. This is the state of my life when the events began, when Michael and Carol appeared one afternoon together, carrying a folder of documents and smiling in a way that felt rehearsed. I had been sitting with a crossword puzzle, struggling with a 7-letter word for betrayal, ironically enough, when I heard the knock. I opened the door to see them both standing there, the rare occasion of my children together, and for one brief, foolish moment, my heart leapt. I thought perhaps they had come to surprise me, to spend an evening in the old house, to share a meal and laughter the way we once did when Eleanor was alive. I stepped aside quickly, eager, telling them to come in, that I would put on a pot of coffee. But even as I spoke, I noticed the papers in Michael's hand, the thin smile on Carol's lips, and the way they exchanged glances as if reminding each other of a script. That was the moment, though I did not yet realize it, when the foundation of my trust began to crack, when the illusion of family devotion began its slow collapse. When Michael and Carol came into the house that afternoon, they carried with them not only the weight of their presence, which had grown rare and strained over the years, but also the awe of something carefully planned, and I should have noticed it. In the way their movements were synchronized, in the way Carol set her purse down deliberately on the side table and Michael held the folder against his chest as if it was something precious yet dangerous. But my hunger for family closeness made me blind to the signs. I told them to sit in the living room, and I busied myself in the kitchen making coffee, though my hands shook slightly as I measured the grounds, because deep down I knew that surprise visits from my children were never about affection or nostalgia. They were always about some matter that required my signature, my account number, or my quiet acquiescence. When I returned with the coffee, setting the cups carefully on the table, I saw Michael had already opened the folder and spread out several sheets, his brow furrowed in that professional way he used to impress clients, while Carol leaned back with her legs crossed, her face arranged into what might have passed as a smile if it had not been so brittle. "Dad," Michael began, his voice measured, carrying that mixture of authority and reassurance he had perfected over years of corporate meetings. "We've been working on some paperwork that needs to be handled quickly, and since you're on the property, deed and some of the family accounts, it requires your acknowledgement. It's nothing complicated, just routine documents to make sure everything stays in order." He slid a few sheets toward me, their corners aligned with precision, and tapped them with the tip of his pen as if to guide my attention without allowing me to linger too long. Carol, quick to reinforce the narrative, added with a light laugh that did not reach her eyes, "Yes, Dad. Honestly, it's really just a formality. Nothing you need to worry about, but you know how banks and lawyers are. Always demanding signatures from everyone involved. If we don't take care of it now, it might create problems later, and we don't want you to have to deal with that." I should have asked questions. I should have demanded explanations. After all, 40 years in insurance had trained me to scrutinize every word, every clause, every loophole. But the way they looked at me, with that mixture of feigned concern and subtle impatience, made me feel like a burden in my own home, and I told myself that resisting them would only widen the distance that already stretched between us. Michael placed a pen in front of me, its weight oddly heavy in my hand, and as I stared at the lines waiting for my name, Carol reached out and touched my wrist gently, the first affectionate gesture from her in yours, whispering, "It's routine, Dad. Just sign, please, so we can all relax and have some time together after." That whisper pierced me more than the words on the paper could have, because it awakened the starving part of me that longed to believe my children wanted to stay, wanted to drink coffee and reminisce, wanted to be with me not because they needed something but because they cared. The papers were dense with legal language, paragraphs of clauses that blurred before my tired eyes, and though part of me struggled to focus, to find meaning, the other part, the larger, hungrier part, clung to the hope that by signing I was buying not just peace but connection. I told myself, absurdly, that maybe this was a way of proving my trust, that maybe they would see my loyalty and repay it with warmth. My hand moved almost automatically, scrawling my name on each line Michael indicated, while he nodded approvingly, sliding the completed sheets back into the folder with swift efficiency, as though he had feared hesitation might undo everything. Carol poured herself coffee and took a sip, her eyes fixed on me not with gratitude, but with something closer to calculation, though I refused to interpret it that way then. After the signatures were collected, they relaxed visibly, exchanging a quick glance of satisfaction, and Michael closed the folder with a decisive snap, saying something like, "That takes care of everything, Dad. Thank you. You've saved us a lot of headaches," Carol chimed in with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Yes, now everything is protected, especially your house, which is what we were worried about most of all." Protected. That word lingered in my mind, long after they had gathered their things and stood up to leave, offering hurried goodbyes rather than the promised evening together. I watched from the window as they got into the car, the folder safely tucked between them, and drove away without once looking back. The silence that returned to the house was sharper than usual, filled with the echo of their rehearsed lines, and I found myself whispering Eleanor's name into the empty room, as if she might answer, as if she might tell me whether I had done the right thing or whether I had just made a terrible mistake. That night I could not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the spot where the papers had lain, my mind circling the same uneasy questions. Why had they both come together when usually they could not coordinate even for holidays? Why had Carol touched my wrist when affection had long been absent? Why had Michael rushed my signature with such urgency? The phrases they had used, routine, formality, protection, repeated in my head like a chant, and though I tried to dismiss my doubts as the paranoia of an old man, I could not shake the feeling that something inside me had been quietly stolen, that I had given away more than just a signature. In the darkness of my kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator as my only witness, I realized that the trust I had clung to all these years might have been nothing more than a carefully exploited weakness, and though I did not yet know the full shape of the trap, I knew I was already caught in it. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, folded into a plain white envelope that at first looked no different from the usual stream of utility bills and insurance notices, and if not for the return address of the county courthouse, I might have tossed it aside until later, but something in the weight of the paper and the formal lettering made my stomach tighten before I had even broken the seal. I carried it to the kitchen table, where the sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, and with hands that felt clumsier than usual, I tore the envelope open, sliding out several pages stamped with official seals and dense with legal jargon. My eyes moved slowly across the lines, trying to force sense from the maze of phrases, until a sentence leapt out and seemed to burn itself into my vision. my name listed among the parties to a divorce proceeding between my son Michael and his wife, of 20 years. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, some bureaucratic error that had tangled my name into a case where it did not belong. But the longer I read, the clearer it became that my signature, scrawled in black ink at the bottom of the very documents Michael and Carol had brought to me weeks earlier, had tethered me directly to his marital unraveling. I pushed the papers away and sat back, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, the sound echoing through the empty house as if to underline my foolishness. My own children had come into my home, had looked me in the eye, and had told me it was routine, a formality, a protection, and in my hunger to believe them I had not only signed, but smiled as I did so, thinking that trust would bring us closer, that obedience would earn affection. Instead, I found myself named in a divorce settlement, not merely as a witness, but as a guarantor of obligations I did not understand. Obligations that stretched into the thousands and tied my own assets, my own home, to the debts and promises of a marriage I had no part in. The courthouse letter spoke of property divisions, of spousal support, of financial assurances, and there in the middle of it all was my name, woven into the machinery of their disintegration. I felt my chest tighten as if the air in the room had thickened, and I rose, pacing from kitchen to hallway to living room, muttering Eleanor's name under my breath as if she might still walk in and steady me with her calm hand on my shoulder. I thought of how often she had warned me about my blind spots where the children were concerned, how she had once said, "Walter, love makes you generous, but it also makes you gullible, and one day they may use that against you." At the time, I had dismissed it as her overprotective streak, her tendency to worry too much, but now I saw her words etched into the very lines of the court documents, proof that her caution had been prophecy. In the days that followed, the first ripples of humiliation began to spread through my life. A phone call from an old colleague who had seen my name in the public court docket left me fumbling for explanations, pretending I had agreed to act only as a neutral witness, when inside I burned with shame at how easily I had been manipulated. At the pharmacy, the clerk who had known me for years mentioned softly that she hoped the family situation would resolve without too much damage, and I realized that word of my involvement was already seeping into the small town, painting me as a man dragged into his children's mess, a man foolish enough to stake his security on someone else's broken marriage. I felt stripped of dignity, like a fool paraded through the streets for trusting too much. At night, sleep eluded me, and instead I sat in my chair by the window, replaying every detail of that afternoon when Michael and Carol had come to my door. I remembered the firmness of Michael's hand as he slid the pen toward me, the softness of Carol's touch on my wrist, the carefully chosen words, formality, routine, protection, and I realized they had rehearsed it all, conspired not only in legal deception, but in emotional manipulation, using gestures of intimacy they had long withheld to disarm me. Each recollection stung deeper, for it showed me that their betrayal was not a careless accident, but a calculated act, crafted to exploit the one weakness I had left, my need to be loved by them. The real blow came a week later when a follow-up notice arrived, outlining in detail the responsibilities attached to my signature. I was listed not merely as a witness, but as a co-signer guaranteeing certain financial obligations, meaning that if Michael failed to meet his spousal support payments or other debts arising from the divorce, the burden would legally fall upon me. The sums listed were staggering, far beyond what my modest pension and savings could endure, and for the first time I saw the shadow of losing my home, the place where Eleanor's presence still lingered in every corner, the place I had clung to as proof that I still belonged somewhere. The thought of strangers forcing me out, of the family photos and Eleanor's recipe box being boxed up and discarded, made me feel physically ill. I sat at the kitchen table, gripping the edges so tightly my knuckles whitened, whispering aloud, they would let me lose everything. They would watch me sink. I tried to call Michael first, dialing his number with trembling fingers, and when his voicemail answered, I left a message demanding to know why my name was tied to his divorce, why he had not told me the truth. His reply came hours later in a curt text message. "Dad, don't worry. It's just a technicality. You won't lose anything. Trust us, trust us." The very words that had led me into this snare. Carol was no better. When I reached her, she spoke in that clipped tone she used when she wanted to shut down an argument. "It's paperwork, Dad. You're overreacting. Michael needs this to protect his assets, and since you're part of the deed, your signature was necessary. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I wanted to scream into the phone, to tell her that they had lied, that they had stolen my consent, that they had made me complicit in a disaster, but my throat tightened and all I managed was a choked. Eleanor would be ashamed, before she hung up without a word. From that moment on, I felt the ground of my life tilt. The ordinary routines, making coffee, reading the paper, walking to the mailbox, were poisoned by the knowledge that somewhere in a courthouse, my name sat bound to debts and quarrels that were not mine, that my children had reduced me to a pawn in their selfish games. The humiliation grew heavier each day, not only because of the legal trap, but because of the realization that I had been played with such ease, that the two people who should have guarded my dignity had instead stripped it from me with a smile and a touch. I found myself talking to Eleanor's photograph late at night, confessing that I had failed to protect what she and I had built, that I had allowed our legacy to be entangled in deceit. Her smiling face offered no reproach, but in the stillness I felt my own guilt like a stone pressing on my chest. The first escalation of this ordeal was not only legal but emotional. The dawning awareness that my children no longer saw me as a father but as a signature, a wallet, a convenient guarantor of their recklessness. It was a slow-burning humiliation that spread through every corner of my days, gnawing at me with each reminder that my trust had been twisted into chains. And though I tried to tell myself that perhaps it was all misunderstanding, that perhaps they had not realized the risk they placed upon me, the harder truth whispered louder. They knew, and they had chosen to gamble with my life anyway. That was when the bitterness began to bloom inside me, a bitterness that would not fade, for it marked the beginning of the unraveling, the moment when I ceased to be their father and became instead their victim. The real breaking point came when I was summoned to a preliminary hearing, not because I had been accused of anything, but because my signature tied me legally to the case, and the courthouse, with its polished floors and echoing corridors, became the stage on which I first understood the full magnitude of what Michael and Carol had done. I remember sitting on the hard wooden bench outside the family court, my hands folded tightly in my lap as if gripping myself would keep me from sliding into panic, and listening to the hum of conversations around me, lawyers in tailored suits, speaking briskly about settlements, clerks carrying files like soldiers carrying ammunition, and all the while I felt smaller and smaller, like a man who had wandered into a battlefield without armor. When my name was called and I stepped into the chamber, I saw Michael already seated at one table, his jaw set, his eyes avoiding mine, and across from him sat his wife and her attorney, who spoke in quick, decisive tones, listing assets, obligations, and financial guarantees. The judge, in a voice that carried no malice but no sympathy either, read aloud that I, Walter Green, had signed documents that made me a guarantor of support, payments, should Michael fail to meet them, and in that moment the illusion that this was all some harmless formality shattered entirely. It was explained with a kind of bureaucratic coldness that chilled me to the bone, that because I was on the deed of Michael's house as part of a refinancing arrangement from years earlier, and because my signature appeared on the most recent settlement documents, I was effectively bound to provide financial assurance for obligations that could stretch for a decade or more. The numbers being discussed were not modest. They spoke of monthly payments that eclipsed my pension, sums that would drain my savings in less than a year, amounts that could force the sale of my home. As the attorney spoke, I found myself gripping the edge of the table, my knuckles white, and I thought of Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, of the little recipe cards in the kitchen, of the quiet evenings spent reading in the chair by the window, and all I could see was the image of strangers walking through my front door with clipboards, appraising what could be sold to cover debts that were never mine. Michael never looked at me. Not once. He sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the table, letting his lawyer speak for him as though the man who had raised him, who had carried him on his shoulders at the county fair, who had stayed up late to help with algebra homework, was not even in the room. Carol was not present, but her absence spoke louder than words. She had played her part already, delivering me to this snare with a gentle touch and a practiced smile, and now she could remain invisible while the machinery of betrayal ground forward. I wanted to stand up and shout, to pound the table and demand that the judge see the truth, that my children had misled me, that my signature was stolen through deception, but my voice felt locked in my throat, as though shame itself had placed its hand over my mouth. That night, back in my empty house, I sat for hours at the kitchen table with the documents spread out before me, tracing each clause with trembling fingers, reading and rereading the sentences until the words blurred. Every line confirmed the same nightmare. I had been turned into collateral, a human safety net for debts that were not mine. I thought about calling Michael. But what would I say that had not already been said? What answer could he give that would erase the fact that he had placed his father's security on the altar of his divorce settlement? I thought about calling Carol, but I knew she would dismiss my fear with that same impatient tone, telling me I was overreacting, telling me it was nothing, when in truth it was everything. I poured myself a glass of water and sat staring at the surface, and in the silence of that moment I realized something that cut deeper than all the legal jargon. My children did not see me as a father anymore, not as a man who had sacrificed for them, but as a resource, a name, a piece of property to be leveraged. I had become less than human in their eyes, and the realization hollowed me out like nothing before. The next morning I forced myself to meet with a lawyer of my own, a quiet man recommended by an old neighbor who had once gone through a probate dispute. He listened patiently as I laid out the story, his brow furrowing as I described how Michael and Carol had come together, how they had assured me it was routine, how they had guided my pen without ever once speaking the word divorce. When I finished, he pushed the documents back toward me and said, in a voice that carried both weariness and pity, "Mr. Green, what they did may not rise to the level of outright fraud in the eyes of the court, but it is clear you were misled. The problem is that your signature is here, clear and valid. Undoing this will not be simple." His words fell like stones into the pit of my stomach, and for a moment I imagined myself reduced to a wandering old man, stripped of house and savings, a casualty of his own blind trust. But then something stirred in me, something that had been buried under years of passivity and yearning for affection, and I told myself that if I allowed this to continue, if I accepted quietly that my children could gamble away my life, then I was already dead in all but name. The midpoint of this ordeal was not just the courtroom, not just the revelation of obligations, but the awakening of a grim resolve inside me, a determination that I would not simply lie down and let them harvest the last remnants of my life. I looked at the lawyer across the desk and said, with a steadiness that surprised even me, "Then we fight. We fight to untangle this. I will not let them bury me while I am still breathing." When I left his office, the sky had darkened with the weight of an approaching storm, and the wind pressed against me as I walked slowly to my car, but for the first time in months I felt a flicker of clarity. My children had underestimated me. They had thought my trust was bottomless, my will too weak to resist, but they had forgotten that beneath the weariness of age there still remained a man who had built a life through decades of discipline and labor. a man who could endure humiliation, but not annihilation. That night, as I sat by the window with Eleanor's photograph beside me, I whispered to her that I would not let them win, that I would not let the home we had built together be stolen by deceit. And though the room gave no answer, I felt a faint sense of her approval in the silence. The midpoint of my story was not merely the discovery of betrayal, it was the moment when fear and shame transformed into a fierce, almost desperate determination to resist, to reclaim what little dignity remained. It was the moment when I understood that the children I had raised with tenderness had chosen to see me as expendable, and that the only way to preserve the meaning of my life was to stand against them. And though the path ahead promised confrontation, expense, and perhaps more humiliation, I felt in my bones that I could not turn back. The weeks that followed the hearing were like living in a fog of betrayal that grew thicker with every new revelation. And what began as a gnawing suspicion hardened into undeniable truth when the lawyer I had hired began uncovering the details, hidden beneath the neat signatures and rehearsed smiles of my children. He explained that Michael's divorce settlement was not only about property division and spousal support, but also about securing financial guarantees that he had no means of providing himself given his debts and the reckless way he had mortgaged his house and spent far beyond his means. My name had not been included by accident, nor as a simple witness or co-signer out of technical necessity. No, my signature had been deliberately placed as collateral, as the safety net that would reassure the court that Michael's obligations would be met, and without me, he might have faced penalties, even jail time, for attempting to conceal assets. In other words, I was not simply a bystander caught in the crossfire of his marriage's collapse. I was the foundation upon which he and Carol had decided to build their escape route. And the more my lawyer explained, the clearer it became that this had not been Michael's scheme alone. Carol's name appeared in correspondence between attorneys, her suggestions woven into the phrasing of certain clauses, her involvement far deeper than I could have imagined. And in that realization, I felt a hollowing despair, because it meant that both of them, my son and my daughter, had united not to protect me, not to care for me, but to use me as a pawn in their desperate game of self-preservation. The sense of conspiracy weighed on me more heavily than the legalities. I would walk through the rooms of my home, brushing my hand against Eleanor's framed photographs, and feel as though every wall had ears, as though the betrayal of my children had stripped away the very safety of my house. I replayed every moment of their visit in my mind, every glance exchanged, every word chosen, and realized that what I had mistaken for warmth was performance, that the hand Carol had laid on my wrist was not affection, but strategy, a touch rehearsed, to break down my defenses. It was as if my own children had studied me, catalogued my weaknesses, and then wielded them against me with precision, and the cruelty of that knowledge burned deeper than the threat of financial ruin. The escalation came swiftly after that, not in the form of more letters from the court, though they did arrive, thick with demands and deadlines, but in the way Michael and Carol themselves responded when I confronted them. I drove to Michael's house one afternoon, the long drive filled with rehearsed speeches I intended to deliver, but when I arrived, he opened the door with a look of irritation rather than surprise, as if he had been expecting this confrontation and had already decided to deflect it. I told him, in a voice shaking with both anger and sorrow, that I knew the truth now, that I understood the weight of the documents I had signed, and that I felt betrayed in a way deeper than words could describe. He listened, arms crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line, and when I had finished he shrugged and said, "Dad, you're exaggerating. You've always been dramatic about things. This is just paperwork. You're not going to lose your house, for God's sake. It's just a guarantee, and you won't ever even notice it's there." His dismissal struck me harder than a physical blow, because it revealed not only his indifference to my fear, but his contempt for it. When I pressed him, asking why he had not been honest, why he had not trusted me enough to explain before shoving a pen into my hand. His response was colder still. "Because you would have made a scene," he said flatly, "and we didn't have time for that. Carol and I knew you'd sign anyway, so we just did what needed to be done. You've got more than enough money sitting around, and you don't even use it. You live in that house like a ghost. Better that it helps us than just rots away." I left his house shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel until they ached, and when I returned home I called Carol, demanding an explanation from her as well. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and rehearsed, and when I asked her how she could have taken part in such a deception, she sighed as if speaking to a stubborn child. "Dad, stop turning this into a melodrama. Michael is my brother, and I couldn't let him drown. You wouldn't either if you weren't so wrapped up in your pride. All you did was sign some papers. You're not going to end up on the street. But if you did, maybe it would finally teach you that money isn't everything." Her words sliced through me, not only because they were cruel, but because they carried that tone of superiority she had adopted in adulthood, as though I were a foolish, old man incapable of understanding reality, as though decades of raising her and her brother, of working long hours to keep food on the table and pay for their schooling, meant nothing now that they saw me as expendable. The realization that they had united against me, that they had spoken of me in hushed conversations where I was not a father but an obstacle to be managed, filled me with a kind of sickness I had never known. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, imagining their whispered plans, their shared satisfaction as they watched me sign away my safety, and I felt not only betrayed but erased, as if the man I had been to them all my life had vanished, and in his place was a name, a signature, a set of numbers to be exploited. The escalation of the conflict was not simply that I now faced financial ruin, but that I could no longer deny the depth of their contempt, the way they had stripped me of dignity with cold deliberation. My lawyer confirmed my worst fears when he showed me correspondence that made it plain. Carol had advised Michael to involve me directly, suggesting that because I was still on certain accounts and property deeds, it would be easy to frame my involvement as routine. Her words, written in cold black print, echoed the exact phrases she had spoken in my living room, the same careful assurances that had lulled me into complacency. To see them on the page, stripped of tone or inflection, was to see my daughter not as the child I once cradled in my arms, but as an architect of my humiliation, and I sat staring at the document for so long that the letters blurred, the paper trembling in my hand as though it burned. From there, the blows kept coming. My bank called to verify unusual activity on one of my accounts, activity traced back to transactions Michael had initiated using powers of attorney I had signed years ago when he helped me refinance my home. The thought that he might now be draining my savings without my knowledge drove me into a panic that lasted for days, each phone call from the bank like a knife to the gut. My lawyer managed to freeze the accounts temporarily, but the trust was gone, and I found myself pacing the house at night, every creak of the floorboards reminding me that my security was not my own, that even within these walls I was vulnerable to the machinations of the very children I had once sworn to protect. The second escalation, the true height of the storm before the breaking point, was the discovery not only that I had been deceived into financial ruin, but that my children's motives were not desperation alone, but greed and calculation. They had not acted in panic, grasping at straws in a moment of crisis, but had instead built a strategy around my gullibility, weaving a net that caught me neatly and without resistance. They had measured my loneliness, my desire to be loved, and they had weaponized it. When I finally saw the shape of their betrayal in full, it left me hollow in a way I can scarcely describe. It was as though they had looked at me not as a man, but as a ledger, a balance sheet to be manipulated, and in that realization I felt something inside me crack, something that had held for decades, even through neglect and distance, and now it gave way entirely. I sat alone in my living room one evening, the folder of documents spread before me, and I whispered aloud, not to Eleanor this time, but to the empty air. They don't love me. They never did. They only loved what I could give them. Saying it aloud was like stepping off a cliff, a free fall into a truth I had avoided for years. And yet, in that fall, there was also a kind of grim freedom, because once the illusion was shattered, I could no longer be bound by it. The escalation of betrayal had left me stripped of illusions, and though the pain was raw and unbearable, it also ignited a spark of resolve deeper than before, a resolve not only to fight legally, but to sever the chains of obligation and expectation that had bound me to children who no longer saw me as human. The culmination of this long ordeal, the moment when I could no longer ignore the truth, came to me not in the form of a letter, or even a phone call, but in the quiet, almost surreal confrontation that played out when Michael and Carol decided to come to my house, to sit across from me as though we were family, as though all the lies, all the deceit, had never happened. It was a cold afternoon, the kind of late autumn day where the sky was dull and uninviting, and the wind rattled against the windows as though trying to break in, to force its way into the house, much like the betrayal that had been eating away at me. For months, I had not invited them. I had not asked for their presence, and yet, in some part of me, I still yearned for the return of the family I had known before everything fell apart, before my name had been scrawled across their mess like a signature on an empty promise. They arrived together, walking into my house with that same practiced ease as though nothing had changed, as though their actions had not already dragged me into the depths of a nightmare. Michael looked the same as ever, his suit pressed, his face a mask of impatience, while Carol, just a step behind, wore the same artificial smile that I had come to know over the years, the smile that said nothing, that concealed everything. They took seats without being invited, without the hesitance that would have been natural for people who had wronged someone, and Carol, with her ever-present air of control, spoke first. "Dad, we've been trying to reach you," she said, her voice carrying the same patronizing tone that had infuriated me so many times before. "We've been worried about you. You've been distant lately, and we want to make sure you're doing all right." Her words felt hollow, as if they were rehearsed lines, a script that had been written long ago for a situation just like this. And I realized, as I sat there staring at her, that they had come not to apologize, not to make amends, but to further entrench themselves in the illusion they had built, a false narrative where they were still the caring children, and I was still the fragile, old father who needed their guidance and their protection. But I had seen through the facade. The mask had slipped too many times for me to ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath and let the silence stretch between us, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over me. "I know why you're here," I said, my voice steady, though it trembled with the anger that I had held back for so long. "I know what you've done, and I know you think you can just walk back in and make it all disappear." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Carol's smile never wavered. She looked at me with that same cold, calculating gaze, the one that made me feel small, insignificant. "Dad, you're overreacting," she said softly, as though trying to placate a child. "We've always been there for you. We're just trying to help, trying to make sure that everything is settled, that nothing gets messy." But the words rang false, and in that moment I could see them for what they really were, an attempt to manipulate me once again, to pull me back into the web of lies they had spun. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the table, and met their eyes one by one. "No," I said firmly, the word cutting through the air like a knife. "You've been using me. Both of you. All these years, I've been nothing more than a resource to you, a way to get what you wanted. And now, when you finally drained me dry, You think you can waltz in and act like nothing's happened, like I'm still your father, still the man who would bend over backward for you. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to silence him, the fury rising in my chest. I've spent my life helping you, protecting you, giving you everything I had, and this is how you repay me, by dragging me into your mess and making me responsible for your failures? Carol's smile faltered for just a moment, and I saw a flicker of irritation cross her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by that same air of superiority. "Dad, you're being dramatic," she said, her tone cool. "We're just trying to help you understand that this is the way things are. We need to be able to move forward. The house, the accounts, everything, it needs to be settled, and we've done what we had to do." But as she spoke, I could hear the words for what they were. A justification, an excuse for the betrayal they had carefully planned. They hadn't done anything because they needed to. They had done it because they wanted to, because they thought I was too weak, too dependent on them to fight back. Something snapped inside me. The years of feeling helpless. The years of being ignored. The years of pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. All of it came crashing down in that moment, and I realized that I was done. Done being a pawn in their game. Done being the victim of their manipulation. The man who had always been willing to give and give, to sacrifice for his children, had finally had enough. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the window. The sky outside was overcast, the clouds hanging heavy, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. I turned back to face them, and for the first time in months, I looked them both squarely in the eye. "You think I'm weak. You think I'm too old to fight, too old to make a stand. But I'm not. I'm not some fool you can manipulate anymore. I've seen through everything you've done, and I won't stand for it. You've stolen from me, you've used me, and now you've pushed me too far." Michael and Carol exchanged a glance, but this time it wasn't the smug look of superiority they had worn before. This time there was something else in their eyes, something between guilt and fear. "Dad, you don't know what you're saying," Michael said, his voice lower now, the calm veneer slipping. "We did what we had to do. It's all in the paperwork. You signed it. There's nothing we can do about it now." But I wasn't listening anymore. The words that had been building up inside me for months poured out in a rush. "I don't care about the paperwork. I care about the fact that you've treated me like an object, something to be used and discarded. I care about the fact that you've made me complicit in your lies, and I won't let you get away with it." I turned away from them then, walking to the table where the papers still lay, and picked up the contract that had bound me to their scheme. I looked at it for a long time, the weight of the decision settling over me, and then, with a sharp motion, I tore the document in half. The sound of it ripping was like the release of a dam, the final shattering of a false reality. When I turned back to Michael and Carol, they were both standing now, the arrogance gone from their faces, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You can't do that," Carol said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Those are legally binding documents." "I don't care," I said, my voice steady. "You don't get to control me anymore. I've spent my life trying to protect you, trying to make sure you were taken care of, but for no more. I've had enough." I felt a strange peace settle over me as I spoke those words, a peace that came from finally releasing the burden of their expectations, finally seeing them for who they were. They had tried to break me, to use me, but in that moment I realized that no matter what happened next, I was no longer their victim. I was free. They left, as I knew they would, not with the satisfaction of having won, but with the weight of their own guilt heavy in the air between us. And as they walked out the door, I felt something shift inside me, something I had not felt in years. The first stirrings of self-respect, of the man I used to be rising from the ashes of their betrayal. The climax of this ordeal was not about victory over them, but victory over myself. I had reclaimed my dignity, my strength, and my sense of self. I was no longer the man who had signed away his life for the sake of family loyalty. I was a man who had learned, painfully but irrevocably, that family was not about sacrifice without respect, and that love without boundaries was just another way to be exploited. And as I stood there, the torn papers at my feet, I felt the weight of all those years lift from my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I was free. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, I found a strange sense of peace settling over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from victory, nor the satisfaction of having won a battle, but a quiet, almost serene realization that I had finally broken free from the trap my children had set. I didn't hear from Michael or Carol after that day. They didn't try to reach out, didn't attempt to explain or apologize, and part of me had expected that. I had always known deep down that once I refused to play along, once I stopped being the father they could manipulate, there would be nothing left to say. They had already made their decisions, and those decisions had cost them more than they could have imagined. But I also knew that I had made my own decision, one that had cost me something too. The family I'd once known, the bond I'd spent years nurturing, was gone. There would be no more Sunday dinners, no more phone calls to ask how I was doing, no more of the small gestures that had once made me feel like I still mattered. It was strange, in the days that followed, how much lighter I felt. My days no longer began with a heavy dread, a sense of inevitable loss. Instead, I woke each morning with a clarity I hadn't known in years. I didn't have to wait for a phone call, didn't have to wonder when they would show up, didn't have to second-guess every conversation, wondering if I was being manipulated again. The house, which had once felt like a prison of memories and unspoken expectations, now felt like a place I could finally make my own. I spent time sorting through the things I'd left behind, slowly deciding what to keep and what to let go. Eleanor's things still filled the rooms, but I found that her absence no longer felt like an unbearable weight. Instead, it felt like an invitation, an opening to move forward, to build a new life in the spaces that had once been crowded with regret and silence. I never got my money back, and I never did get any kind of apology from Michael or Carol, but I realized something important in those quiet days after the storm. None of that mattered. The legal battles and the betrayal had been part of a larger reckoning, a reminder that I had spent too many years living for others, giving my love and my loyalty without ever asking for respect in return. It wasn't about the money, the house, or the accounts. It was about reclaiming my own worth, my own sense of self. I was not just a resource for my children. I was a person, a man who had lived through loss, through hardship, through joy, and through love, and my life was worth more than the pieces they had tried to claim. One afternoon, a few weeks after the confrontation, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun dip low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I had always loved the sunsets here, back when I was younger, when Eleanor and I would sit together and talk about our dreams, about the life we had built, and about what we hoped to leave behind. It had felt like our own private ritual, a way to say goodbye to the day, to share the small moments that kept us connected. It was in those moments that I realized I had never truly said goodbye to Eleanor. I had held on to her memory, to our life together, and in doing so, I had allowed myself to be swept into the role of the dutiful father, the man who sacrificed his own needs for the sake of his children, even when they no longer cared. But now, as I sat alone on the porch, the last rays of the sun warming my face, I felt a quiet sense of closure. I had done my best. I had loved them both, given them everything I had, and I had nothing more to give. I still think about Michael and Carol sometimes. though not with anger anymore. I think about what they lost, and what they will continue to lose as they chase after their own lives, unaware that the very thing they sought to protect, money, power, status, has already slipped through their fingers. The house was sold in the end, the buyer eager to close quickly, and my share, though a fraction of what I had once hoped for, was enough to secure my future. I took the money, placed it into an account, and moved on with my life. I found a small apartment in the city, close to a park and a few coffee shops I had always wanted to visit. It was a simple place, nothing grand, but it felt like mine in a way that my old house never had. The space was light, filled with the kind of freedom I had not experienced in years. I started visiting the park more often, watching the children play, the young families walking their dogs, the old couples sitting on benches, and I began to wonder what it would be like to start over. I didn't know if I would ever have the kind of family I once had, or if I could ever trust again in the way I once did. But I knew that I had my own life to live now, a life where I could make the choices that mattered to me. I took up painting again, something I had abandoned long ago, and found a kind of peace in it. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the brush in my hand and the canvas in front of me. Months passed, and eventually I received a letter from Michael. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more of an acknowledgement, a half-hearted attempt to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. He asked if I would be willing to meet, to talk about what had happened, to try to understand each other. I read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the drawer. I didn't need to respond. I didn't need to meet. The truth was, the chapter with them had already ended. I had no intention of revisiting it. Sometimes, when I walk through the park or sit in my new apartment, I find myself reflecting on the past, on the choices I made, and on the man I was before all of this began. I think about how easy it is to lose yourself in the roles others assign to you. How easy it is to forget who you really are when you've spent a lifetime giving pieces of yourself away. But I also think about how strong I am now, how much I've learned, and how much I've grown. The pain of betrayal, the loss of family, has left scars, but those scars are no longer sources of shame. They are part of the story that has shaped me into the person I am today. And for the first time in a long time, I am content with who that person is. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if Michael or Carol will ever truly understand what they did, or if they will ever be able to face the consequences of their actions. But I know this. I have nothing left to prove to them. I have nothing left to give, and that, in itself, is a kind of freedom. The past is behind me now, and I am free to live the rest of my life as I see fit, without the burden of their expectations, their lies, or their manipulation. I can finally live for myself. As I sit on the porch, the evening sky darkening into twilight, I find myself at peace. The house behind me is no longer the symbol of my failure or my sacrifice. It is simply a part of my past, a chapter I have closed. And as the stars begin to appear one by one in the sky above, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that I have reclaimed my life, that I have fought for my dignity, and that no one, not even my children, can ever take that from me again.